The stars streaked past the cockpit window like scattered diamonds as Captain Elias Voss wrestled with the controls of his malfunctioning spaceship. Alarms blared around him, their shrill tones piercing through the chaos. Sparks flew from panels that had once hummed with precision engineering. His knuckles were white on the yoke, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air circulating in the cabin. "Come on, don't fail me now," Elias muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with desperation. He was no pilot. His expertise lay in fixing things, not flying them. But circumstances had left him little choice. A rogue asteroid had struck the ship's engine hours earlier, crippling its navigation systems and sending it hurtling toward an uncharted planet below. With a final jolt, the ship crashed into the alien terrain, skidding across a field of iridescent grass before coming to a shuddering halt. Smoke billowed from the wreckage as Elias groaned, his head pounding. For a moment, he simply sat there, trying to steady his breathing. Then, remembering protocol, he unbuckled himself and stumbled out of the mangled craft. The air outside was crisp and carried a faint floral scent. The sky above shimmered in hues of lavender and gold, utterly unlike anything Elias had ever seen. Strange plants swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves glowing softly as if lit from within. It was beautiful, but dangerous beauty always came with risks. Elias grabbed his survival pack, slinging it over one shoulder, and took stock of his surroundings. That was when he heard it, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Turning slowly, he froze at the sight before him. Emerging from the nearby forest was a creature straight out of myth, a dragon. Its scales gleamed like liquid metal, shifting colors as it moved. Massive wings folded against its back, and eyes as deep and dark as space locked onto him. For a second, Elias thought he was hallucinating. Dragons weren't real. They hadn't been for centuries. Yet here one stood, its presence commanding and terrifying. Before he could react, another figure stepped forward from behind the beast. She was tall and regal, her skin a pale silver blue that shimmered faintly in the light. Her hair cascaded down her back like molten platinum, and her golden armor gleamed with intricate designs. In her hand, she held a staff topped with what looked like a miniature sun. "That is my royal guardian," she said, her voice sharp and imperious. "Step away from Nexus immediately." Elias raised his hands instinctively, showing he meant no harm. "I didn't mean to intrude," he stammered. "My ship crashed. I'm just trying to survive." The woman narrowed her eyes, clearly unimpressed by his explanation. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of attacking him, the dragon lowered its massive head and sniffed curiously at the pouch hanging from Elias's belt. Acting purely on instinct, Elias reached inside and pulled out a piece of dried fruit, one of the emergency rations he packed. He held it out tentatively, half expecting the dragon to snap at him. To everyone's surprise, including his own, the dragon accepted the offering, swallowing it whole before letting out a contented rumble. The woman gasped audibly, her composure cracking for the first time. "How did you do that?" she demanded, her tone equal parts shock and suspicion. "Nexus has never responded to anyone but me." Elias shrugged helplessly. "Back where I come from, we learned long ago that dragons respond better to kindness than fear." The woman stared at him, her expression unreadable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she sighed. "You will explain yourself further. And if I find your actions suspicious, know this: I won't hesitate to have you executed." As she motioned for him to follow her, Elias couldn't help but glance back at the dragon, which gave him a look that almost seemed grateful. Whatever awaited him next, one thing was certain: nothing about this day would be ordinary. The trials had changed everything, or so Elias thought. Zinara no longer treated him like an outsider to be tolerated. Instead, she began consulting him openly, her tone less sharp and more curious. Yet despite their growing camaraderie, a shadow still loomed over the citadel. The sickness plaguing the Arathian people was worsening, and dragons across the empire were disappearing without explanation. One evening, as Elias pored over ancient carvings in the library with Nexos curled protectively nearby, Zenara stormed in, her usual composure shattered. Her armor was streaked with dirt, and her hair, usually immaculate, was disheveled. "They're gone," she said hoarsely, sinking into a chair opposite him. "3 more dragons have vanished from the southern territories." Elias frowned, setting down the crystal shard he'd been examining. "Vanished? What do you mean?" "No bodies, no signs of struggle. Just empty nests." She clenched her fists tightly around her staff. "This isn't natural. Something, or someone, is behind this." Determined to uncover the truth, Elias suggested they investigate the disappearances together. Reluctantly, Zenara agreed, though she insisted on leading the mission herself. With Nixos carrying them through the skies, they traveled to one of the abandoned nesting grounds, a desolate valley surrounded by jagged cliffs. What they found there chilled Elias to the bone. Strange machinery hummed faintly beneath makeshift shelters, its purpose unclear at first glance. But when Elias examined it closer, his blood ran cold. Tubes filled with glowing liquid pulsed rhythmically, connected to containment pods holding fragments of dragon essence. "This is wrong," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "Your people are harvesting their life force." Zenara's face went pale. "No," she breathed, shaking her head. "Not my people, not willingly." A sudden commotion drew their attention. A group of armored figures emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on the trio. One of them stepped forward, a tall man with cold eyes and a cruel smile. "Princess Zenara," he sneered. "How predictable that you'd come running to save your precious beasts." "Commander Kale," Zenara spat, gripping her staff tightly. "You betrayed us. You've corrupted our bond with the dragons for power." Kale shrugged indifferently. "Power keeps empires alive, Your Highness. Without it, we're nothing. And these creatures," he gestured dismissively toward the pods, "they're expendable." Fury burned in Zenara's eyes, but before she could act, Elias stepped forward. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said firmly. "Dragons aren't tools. They're partners. If you keep exploiting them, you'll destroy both species." Kale laughed harshly. "Sentimental nonsense. Now step aside, human, unless you want to share their fate." But Elias didn't back down. Instead, he turned to Nexos, who let out a low growl. "We won't let you hurt them anymore," Elias declared. In that moment, something remarkable happened. Nexus roared, his massive wings unfurling as he reared up protectively. The sound echoed through the valley, shaking the ground beneath their feet. To everyone's astonishment, other dragons appeared in the distance, drawn by the call. They circled overhead, their cries joining Nexos's in defiance. Cal's men faltered, unnerved by the sudden appearance of so many dragons. Seizing the opportunity, Zenara raised her staff, unleashing a burst of energy that disabled the machines. Together, she and Elias fought back against Cal's forces, their teamwork seamless despite the chaos. When the dust settled, Cal lay defeated, his plans exposed. Zenara stood beside Elias, her expression fierce yet grateful. "You've shown me what true leadership looks like," she admitted quietly. "And you've shown me courage I didn't know I had," Elias replied with a small smile. As the freed dragons soared into the sky, Elias realized the hardest battles were yet to come, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them alongside Zenara. The aftermath of the battle left scars, both visible and invisible. The shattered peaks bore witness to the destruction, with crumbled towers and smoldering ruins marking the end of Cal's regime. But for every shattered stone, there was a glimmer of renewal. Freed dragons soared through the skies once more, their vibrant scales catching the light, as if celebrating their liberation. Across the empire, Arathians began to awaken from the haze of corruption, their bonds with the dragons slowly rekindling. Back at the citadel, Elias found himself at the center of an unexpected movement. Zenara had called upon her people to embrace the ancient rituals Elias had described. Rituals rooted in trust, care, and mutual respect. At first, skepticism lingered. Many Arathians struggled to let go of centuries-old beliefs that viewed dragons as tools rather than partners. Yet when Nexos demonstrated his unwavering loyalty to Elias, others began to reconsider. Under Zenara's guidance, Elias introduced simple practices from Earth's history, sharing meals, speaking words of gratitude, and spending time simply being present with the dragons. It wasn't magic, it was connection. Slowly but surely, the bond between dragon and rider started to heal. Dragons who had once been listless and weak grew stronger, their energy revitalizing not only themselves but also their human counterparts. Zenara herself underwent a transformation. Gone was the imperious princess who saw leadership as dominance. In her place stood a compassionate ruler willing to listen, learn, and adapt. She spent hours meditating with Nexos, learning to sense the subtle shifts in his emotions. And though she still carried herself with regal pride, there was a newfound warmth in her interactions, not just with Elias, but with everyone around her. One evening, as the twin moons bathed the citadel in silvery light, Elias joined Zenara on a balcony overlooking the endless expanse below. Nexus rested nearby, his massive form casting long shadows across the floor. "You've done something remarkable here," Elias said after a moment of silence. "Your people are beginning to remember what truly matters." "It's because of you," Zenara replied, turning to face him. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, a stark contrast to the commanding tone she usually used. "You reminded me, and all of us, that strength doesn't come from control. It comes from unity." Elias chuckled nervously, scratching the back of his neck. "I'm no hero. I just shared some old stories I thought might help." "And they did," Zenara insisted, stepping closer. For a moment, their eyes met, and Elias felt a flutter of something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge before. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. Zenara cleared her throat and stepped back, gesturing toward the horizon. "There's still much work to be done. My engineers are repairing your ship, and soon you'll have to leave." The words hung heavy in the air. Elias nodded slowly, though his heart sank at the thought of parting ways. "Yeah, I guess this isn't really my world." "No," Zenara agreed, her expression tinged with sadness. "But you've changed it, for the better." Over the next few days, preparations for Elias's departure continued. Though the repairs were nearly complete, he couldn't shake the feeling that leaving would mean leaving behind something important. Each night, he sat with Nexos, running his fingers along the dragon's shimmering scales, while recounting tales of Earth. The creature responded with gentle rumbles, as if savoring every word. On the final day, Zenara presented Elias with a small token, a scale from Nexos, polished to a mirror-like shine. "Take this," she said, pressing it into his hand, "a reminder of what we've built together." Elias gripped the scale tightly, overwhelmed by emotion. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." As he boarded his repaired ship, Nexus let out a thunderous roar, shaking the platform. Zenara stood tall, her golden armor gleaming one last time under the sun. "Goodbye, Elias Foss," she called out, her voice carrying across the wind. And as the ship ascended into the stars, Elias knew he'd never forget the alien princess or the dragon who had changed his life forever. The days that followed were a whirlwind of discovery and suspicion. Zenara kept Elias close, assigning him quarters in a corner of the citadel far removed from the bustling activity of her people. It wasn't exactly luxurious. His room was small and sparsely furnished, but it offered a stunning view of the endless skies below. Still, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he stepped into the hallways, golden-eyed servants would pause their work to glance at him curiously before whispering among themselves. Zenara herself remained an enigma. She alternated between interrogating him about Earth's history with dragons and ignoring him completely, burying herself in ancient scrolls or pacing the grand halls of the citadel. Her mood seemed tied to Nexos, who continued to shadow Elias wherever he went. Whenever the dragon nudged Elias affectionately or let out a contented rumble, Zenara's jaw would tighten ever so slightly. One morning, she summoned Elias to the citadel's library, a vast chamber filled with towering shelves of glowing crystals instead of books. The air hummed faintly, as if alive with energy. "Tell me more about your kind," Zenara said without preamble, gesturing for him to sit across from her at a polished stone table. "You claim humans once coexisted with dragons. Prove it." Elias hesitated, unsure where to begin. He didn't have much first-hand knowledge. Most of what he knew came from stories passed down through generations. But as he began recounting tales of brave warriors riding into battle alongside dragons, farmers tending fields protected by loyal winged guardians, and even children playing tag around sleeping beasts, Zenara listened intently. Her sharp gaze never wavered, but there was a flicker of something softer in her expression now, something that might have been hope. When Elias mentioned rituals designed to strengthen the bond between humans and dragons, Zenara leaned forward sharply. Rituals? What kind? They weren't complicated, Elias explained. Mostly sharing meals, speaking kindly, showing respect. On Earth, we believe that dragons could sense emotions. If you treated them with love and care, they'd return it tenfold. Zenara frowned thoughtfully, tapping her staff against the floor. "Love and care," she repeated slowly, as if testing the words. Then, after a long pause, she stood abruptly. "Come with me." She led him deeper into the library, past rows of shimmering crystals, until they reached a secluded alcove. There, embedded in the wall, was a massive crystal pulsating with light. Etched onto its surface were intricate carvings depicting scenes eerily similar to those Elias had described. Figures standing beside dragons, exchanging gifts, performing ceremonies under starlit skies. "These are our ancestors' records," Zenara said quietly, running her fingers over the markings. "Long ago, my people shared such bonds with dragons. But over time, the connection weakened. Dragons became tools rather than partners. And now," her voice trailed off, tinged with sadness. "Now what?" Elias prompted gently. "Now we're dying," Zenara admitted, turning to face him. "Dragons amplify our life force, sustaining us through their presence. But something has corrupted this bond. Many of my people grow ill, and fewer dragons answer our calls each generation." She paused, her piercing eyes locking onto his. "If your kind truly knows how to restore these connections, then perhaps you can save us." Elias felt a weight settle on his shoulders. He wasn't sure he was the right person for this task. He wasn't a scholar, a warrior, or even particularly brave. But looking at Zenara's determined yet vulnerable expression, he realized he couldn't turn away. "I'll do whatever I can," he promised solemnly. For the first time since their meeting, Zenara smiled, not the smug smirk she usually wore, but a genuine, fleeting curve of her lips. "Good," she said, "because failure is not an option for either of us." As they left the library together, Elias noticed Nexos waiting patiently outside. The dragon gave him another nudge, almost as if offering reassurance. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Elias knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't face them alone. The next morning, Elias woke to the sound of Nexos's deep rumble echoing through the halls. He opened his eyes groggily, only to find Zenara standing in the doorway, her golden armor gleaming even in the dim light. "It's time," she announced without preamble. "If you truly understand how to bond with dragons, then you must prove it." "Prove it?" Elias asked, sitting up quickly. "How?" Zenara crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "Through trials. 3 challenges designed to test your connection with Nexus and your worthiness to help my people." Elias swallowed hard. Challenges were not exactly his strong suit, But before he could protest, Zenera turned on her heel and strode out of the room, leaving him no choice but to follow. Nexus trailed behind them, his massive form casting long shadows in the hallway. The first trial took place in the Crystal Caverns, a labyrinthine network beneath the citadel. The cavern walls sparkled with veins of glowing quartz, casting eerie patterns on the floor. As they entered, Zenera handed Elias a small crystal orb. "Your task is simple," she said. "Retrieve 3 identical orbs hidden within the cavern. Nexus will guide you, but only if you trust him completely." With that, she stepped back, watching silently as Elias and Nixos ventured into the twisting tunnels. At first, progress was slow. The paths branched off in countless directions, and strange creatures skittered in the shadows, their glowing eyes watching hungrily. Every wrong turn seemed to lead deeper into confusion. But then Elias remembered Zenera's words. Trust him completely. Taking a deep breath, he placed a hand on Nexos' side and whispered, "Lead the way." To his amazement, the dragon responded immediately, nudging him toward a narrow passage Elias would have overlooked. Together, they navigated the maze, relying on Nexos' instincts and Elias's quick thinking to avoid pitfalls and fend off predators. By the time they returned to Zenera, all 3 orbs were safely tucked into Elias's pack. "Well done," Zenera admitted grudgingly, though her tone suggested she hadn't expected success. The second trial was more complex. They stood before an ancient mechanism suspended over a chasm, a puzzle designed to align floating platforms so they could cross safely. Zenera explained that the solution required both precision and teamwork. "You'll need to direct Nexos while solving the puzzle yourself," she said. "Fail, and you'll fall." Elias felt his stomach drop, but he nodded resolutely. Working together, he and Nixos communicated through gestures and sounds, each step bringing them closer to completing the mechanism. When the final platform clicked into place, Zenera's sharp intake of breath betrayed her surprise. For the third and final trial, they faced a fierce storm conjured by Zenera herself using her staff. Lightning crackled across the sky, and winds threatened to sweep Elias off his feet. His task was clear: use Nixos to shield him from the tempest while retrieving a sacred artifact from the center of the chaos. As the storm raged around them, Elias clung to Nexos' back, shouting encouragement over the roar of the wind. The dragon fought valiantly against the gales, his wings beating powerfully until they reached the artifact. When Elias held it aloft, triumphant, the storm subsided instantly. Zenera approached, her expression softer now. "You've proven yourself," she said quietly, "but there's one thing I don't understand." "What's that?" Elias asked. "Why does Nexos refuse to obey me unless you're here?" Elias smiled faintly. "Maybe because trust isn't about dominance. It's about partnership." Zenera looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. For the first time, Elias saw something new in her gaze: respect. The revelation of Commander Kel's betrayal spread like wildfire through the Arathian Empire. Zenera wasted no time exposing the corruption, broadcasting her findings to every corner of the floating citadels and outposts. The people were outraged, not only by Kel's exploitation of the dragons, but also by the sickness it had caused among their own ranks. For years, they had suffered without understanding why. Now, with the truth laid bare, many rallied behind Zenera, vowing to restore the sacred bond between their kind and the dragons. But Kel wasn't alone in his treachery. He was part of a larger faction known as the Ascendants, a group that believed dominance over dragons, and eventually other species, was the key to survival. Their stronghold was hidden deep within the Shattered Peaks, a jagged mountain range shrouded in perpetual storms. It was there that the final battle would take place. Elias stood beside Zenera on the edge of the citadel platform, watching as Nexos and dozens of other dragons prepared for war. The sight filled him with awe and dread in equal measure. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. Zenera turned to face him, her golden armor gleaming under the twin moons. "We have no choice," she said firmly. "If we don't stop them now, they'll destroy everything. The dragons, our people, even the balance of life itself." Elias nodded, though his stomach churned at the thought of what lay ahead. "Then let's make sure we win." As they took to the skies aboard Nexus, Elias couldn't help but marvel at how far he'd come since his crash landing. Back then, he'd been an ordinary engineer just trying to survive. Now, he was fighting alongside an alien princess and her dragon against forces bent on destruction. Life truly had a way of surprising you. The journey to the shattered peaks was fraught with danger. Lightning crackled around them, and fierce winds threatened to tear them from Nexos's back. But the dragons navigated the chaos with practiced ease, their instincts guiding them safely through the storm. When they reached the fortress, a towering structure carved into the mountainside, they found it heavily guarded. "This is where strategy comes in," Zenara said, her voice steady despite the tension. She divided their forces into teams, each tasked with disabling different parts of the fortress, while she confronted Cal directly. Elias insisted on staying by her side, earning a rare smile of approval. The assault began with a deafening roar as dragons swooped down, scattering the enemy troops. Elias wielded tools salvaged from his ship repairs, using them to disable weapons and traps. Meanwhile, Zenara unleashed waves of energy from her staff, clearing paths for their allies. Together, they fought with a synergy that left their enemies reeling. Inside the fortress, Kale awaited them, surrounded by arcane machinery designed to drain dragon essence on an industrial scale. His eyes gleamed with desperation as he activated the system, intending to use its power against them. "You can't stop progress," he shouted, raising his weapon. "Yes, we can," Zenara replied coldly. With a swift motion, she hurled her staff at the control panel, shattering it. The machine sputtered and died, releasing a wave of pure energy that knocked everyone off their feet. When the dust settled, Kale lay unconscious, his plans in ruins. Zenara knelt beside Elias, helping him up. "It's over," she said softly. "For now," Elias agreed, looking out at the freed dragons circling above. "But rebuilding won't be easy." "No," Zenara admitted, her gaze softening as she looked at him. "But we'll do it together." For the first time, Elias felt hope, not just for the Arathians, but for himself as well. The journey back to Earth felt both familiar and foreign to Elias. The hum of the ship's engines was a comforting sound, but the silence within its walls was deafening. Without Nexos's deep rumbles or Zenara's sharp questions, the spacecraft seemed emptier than ever before. As he floated through the void of space, Elias clutched the dragon scale tightly in his hand, its cool surface grounding him to the memories of everything he'd experienced and everyone he'd left behind. When Elias finally landed on Earth, he expected life to return to normal, but nothing about his old routine felt right anymore. His colleagues marveled at his survival story, peppering him with questions about the alien planet and its people. Yet no matter how many times he recounted his adventures, the words always felt inadequate. How could he explain the majesty of Nexus or the complexity of Zenara? How could he convey the profound connection he'd forged with beings so vastly different from himself? Determined to honor what he'd learned, Elias became an advocate for interstellar peace. He traveled across continents, sharing tales of the Arathian Empire and their sacred bond with dragons. At first, skeptics dismissed his stories as science fiction, but over time, his sincerity won them over. People began to see the value in understanding, not conquering, the unknown. Elias also worked tirelessly to revive Earth's forgotten lore about dragons. He scoured libraries, consulted historians, and even collaborated with scientists to piece together fragments of humanity's past. Together, they uncovered ancient texts describing rituals similar to those he'd introduced to the Arathians. These discoveries sparked a global movement dedicated to fostering empathy and cooperation, not just between humans, but potentially with other intelligent species out there among the stars. Despite his newfound purpose, Elias couldn't deny the ache in his chest whenever he looked up at the night sky. He wondered often about Zenera and Nexus. Was the princess still leading her people with compassion? Had the dragons fully recovered their strength? Did they ever think of him? One evening, while giving a lecture at a university, Elias paused mid-sentence as a sudden commotion erupted outside. Students rushed to the windows, pointing excitedly at the sky. Stepping outside, Elias froze in disbelief. Hovering above the city was a massive dragon-like silhouette, its scales shimmering like liquid gold under the moonlight. Perched gracefully on its back was none other than Zenera. Her armor gleamed brighter than ever, and her hair flowed freely in the wind as she descended toward him. When her feet touched the ground, she smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. "I told you I wouldn't hesitate to execute you if needed," she said teasingly, her voice carrying just enough authority to make Elias grin nervously. "But perhaps I'll let it slide this time." Elias laughed, relief washing over him. "What are you doing here?" Zenera tilted her head slightly, her expression softening. "You changed us, Elias, and now we've come to change you and your world." Behind her, more dragons appeared in the sky, each carrying Arathian riders eager to share their culture and knowledge. For the first time, humanity stood face to face with another civilization, not as conquerors, but as equals. As Elias watched Zenera extend her hand toward him, he realized his journey was far from over. This wasn't goodbye, it was the beginning of something greater. Together, they would bridge worlds, forging bonds stronger than any starlight. And somewhere deep inside, Elias knew he'd found not just a purpose, but a home among the stars. Elias trudged behind the alien princess, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, glowing grass. Nixus, the dragon, followed close by, its massive wings occasionally brushing against the trees as they made their way through the forest. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that this was all some bizarre dream. The towering princess in front of him moved with an air of authority, her golden armor catching the light of the strange sun above. Every step she took seemed deliberate, as if she were reminding him, and perhaps herself, that she was in charge. "Who are you?" she asked abruptly, breaking the silence without slowing her pace. "Elias Voss," he replied quickly, stumbling over a root but catching himself before he fell. "Captain of the exploration vessel Stellar Horizon. Or I guess I was." He glanced back at the wreckage they'd left behind, still smoking faintly in the distance. She turned her head slightly to study him, her piercing gaze making him feel like a bug under a microscope. "You're human." It wasn't a question. It was more like a statement of disbelief. "Yes," Elias said cautiously. "From Earth. You've heard of us." Her lips curled into a faint sneer. "Heard of you? Of course. Your kind is known for your destructive tendencies and reckless expansion, but none of that explains why my guardian, a creature who has never bowed to anyone but me, is acting so docile around you." Elias opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? Back on Earth, dragons had been extinct for centuries, but stories of them were woven into humanity's history. Tales spoke of how ancient humans had earned the trust of these majestic creatures not through force, but through care and respect. Maybe that instinct had been buried deep within him, waiting for a moment like this. Before he could say anything, Nexus let out a low growl and nudged Elias gently from behind, almost knocking him off his feet. The princess stopped walking and spun around, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "What did you do to him?" she demanded, pointing her staff at Elias. "I didn't do anything," Elias protested, raising his hands defensively. "I just gave him food earlier. That's all." The princess stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she dismissed the matter, or at least pretended to. "Come," she said curtly, resuming her march. "We're wasting time." They continued walking until they reached a clearing where a shimmering portal hung suspended in midair. Without hesitation, the princess stepped through it, motioning for Elias to follow. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the world shifted dramatically. They were now standing on a floating platform high above the planet's surface, surrounded by glittering spires and cascading waterfalls that defied gravity. "This is my citadel," the princess announced, gesturing grandly to the breathtaking view. "Here, you will remain until I determine whether you pose a threat to my people or if you truly hold answers we need." Elias gawked at the sight before him, momentarily forgetting his predicament. "It's incredible," he murmured. The princess raised an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to receiving compliments from outsiders. "Yes, well, don't get too comfortable. This place may be beautiful, but it holds many secrets and dangers you cannot yet comprehend." Over the next few hours, Elias found himself subjected to endless questions about Earth, humans, and their supposed connection to dragons. At first, the princess, whose name he learned was Zinara, seemed skeptical of everything he said. But whenever Nexos wandered into the room, the dragon would immediately gravitate toward Elias, ignoring Zinara entirely. Each time this happened, Zinara grew visibly frustrated, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of indifference. One evening, as the twin moons rose over the citadel, Elias sat cross-legged on the floor while Nexos rested beside him. The dragon's warm breath ruffled his hair, and for the first time since the crash, Elias felt a sense of calm. "You're quite the mystery," Zinara remarked from across the room, watching the scene unfold. "So are you," Elias replied with a small smile. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was the beginning of understanding. Whatever it was, Elias knew one thing for certain: his journey here was far from over.